Thank you everyone for coming and visiting today here at Boaters Exchange in New Smyrna. Thank you, Kara, and all the staff here at Boaters Exchange for having me out and have an opportunity to speak to all of you today about fishing tidal zones and how I prepare to be out on the water. And it's always a great opportunity to see all the friendly faces out here and make it interactive, and feel free to ask questions, stop me along the way if you have any questions about anything in particular. But I'll get right into it and talk a little bit about how I started my career in fishing. And it's a fun thing for me. It's not really a career. I do some tournament fishing. Again, my name is Carlos Garcia. Kara introduced me. I do a little bit of brand ambassador work with Boaters Exchange. I'm sponsored by Yamaha, and I have a brand new Maverick HPX V out in the parking lot, and we'll talk about that along the way today because that's one of my most important tools being out on the water. So with that, I'll talk a little bit about how I prepare. Everyone has a smartphone, right? Do you take your smartphone out there and do you have apps that prepare you? Because the preparation doesn't start when you hit the water. It's usually the night before or a couple of days before you actually get out in the water that you're looking at moon phases, the wind, the tides, particularly, especially with this segment that we're going to be talking about today. We actually spend a lot of time with preparation before we even put a rod and a reel in our hands to throw a lure out there. So what I like to do is go out on the tools that we have on our apps, on our smartphones. We have a plethora of different apps, but I'll talk a little bit about the ones that I use. The Navionics app that gives you a little bit about chart and the topology of an area. I use basic weather apps to kind of give me the conditions wind-wise and check moon phases and the tides. So I have a surfing app that gives me a little bit of the wind and the swell condition and things like that if I'm going to go near shore fishing. But today I'll focus a little bit about what I like to do. I usually fish in water that's about 6 inches to about 18 inches. So I'm always getting out there at a lower tide, especially if I'm fishing a tournament or if I'm just recreationally fishing and I want to prepare. I like to get out into an area at low tide just to kind of get an idea of what lies underneath the water as the tide starts flowing in. And I usually target areas where you have a lot of oyster beds and weed lines and grass lines and grass edges and things like that. But I recommend to all anglers that I talk to just try to get into an area at low tide and test the range of your boat. What can your boat handle at low tide, and really get a good idea of what your surroundings look like. I'll talk a little bit about Jacksonville and Steinhatchee, for example, because those are areas that the tide fluctuates. It's totally different. Steinhatchee doesn't get very high, but it does come in quite a bit. Jacksonville, the tide, as you know, fluctuates between, it's about a 6-foot tidal difference every 6 hours. So you really got to be mindful when you're in an area at low tide, or if you happen to arrive there at a higher tide and the tide's dropping, be very careful about leaving yourself enough water and really keeping an eye on your time and the tides. So going into a place at low tide, it just gives you a nice view of the area where the oyster beds are, everything that you're looking for to actually find fish on those areas. Me personally, I stick to areas where there's a lot of oyster beds. I love fishing oyster beds. Why? You have mud minnows that they prey, good fish prey on, whether it be a trout that you're targeting, a redfish, flounder, anything out there that's feeding on the bait. They're usually going to be surrounding, oyster beds or weed lines. But I like oyster beds at low tide because you can actually see a lot of times the fish moving in those areas. And they're out there trying to find shrimp, mud minnows, anything, mullet, all the bait fish that you typically use. How many people like to fish with artificial lures in here?
Sure.
Now, I primarily fish with artificial lures. That's typically how I'm targeting all of my species. I have a different variety of lures that I'll talk about as we get into these tidal zones. And depending on whether you're at low tide and very low water conditions, or the tide's coming in and getting into the grass lines, you may use a totally different bait, different artificial presentation. So, what I like to do is use all of the tools that I have, with the most important one being the boat that I use. I have the Maverick HPXV, the 18-footer, and it drafts in about 8 to 10 inches of water. And but I push the envelope a little bit in that boat. Sometimes I get on the push pole and I try to push it into about 6 to 8 inches, and I'm almost scraping the bottom when I'm doing that. But I do it for a reason, because some of these predator fish, like the redfish, which I target the most, they're shallow water species. They're out there chasing bait in as skinny water as you can get into. So I typically go into an area and use the tools that I have on my boat, like the trolling motor, the motor guide, XI5, and I use my 2 power poles to keep me anchored and stable. Like if I'm getting into an area and I happen to locate some fish that I want to target, and I see them and I have an opportunity to make some presentations, I usually crawl in there with the trolling motor at a very low speed. And then if I'm trying to get acclimated with the area, I use the power poles quite a bit. I move a little bit on the trolling motor, then I stop with the power poles and really try to get into an area, especially where there's oyster beds, to try to make casts all around the oyster beds. And then when you see the little deep troughs in between oyster beds, try to drop your baits in those areas. But you can't plow in there with your trolling motor or anything like that, because that'll spook them. And you really got to be mindful of making sounds when you're in low water conditions. Try to keep your noise to a minimum. Tell your spouses and your friends, don't slam the cooler, don't slam any hatches. Because that could be the difference between you having a very good day out on the water or a bad day. If you get into a school of fish and someone's slamming the hatch in your boat, try to encourage them not to do that. But in the areas that I like to fish, such as Jacksonville and then Steenhatchee, really your navigational equipment that you have on your boat can go a long ways. I use a chip for my GPS unit. I have a Lowrance HDS Live 9-inch screen, and it comes with a Navionics chip, but I've upgraded to a Florida Marine Tracks, and that can help you quite a bit because it already has predefined tracks for your charts, and it'll actually provide you low water tracks that you can run, or any water conditions. It'll provide you with either a red or a black track that you can follow, and that'll help you guide into some of these areas without you taking the risk of hitting the bottom of your boat. Places like Steenhatchee that you may have heard of, lots of rocks. You really got to be careful, and if you have tools that can help you navigate and keep you safe from hitting any obstructions, rocks, oyster beds, or things like that, use that technology that's out there. It's really not all that expensive for the value you get out of it. But as far as locating, using your electronics, put the time in on the water and really get to know your surroundings in any area that you go to. Typically when I'm fishing tournaments, I usually go a couple of days, sometimes a week before I actually fish a tournament. And that's what I do. A lot of times I don't even cast or make any presentations, or try to catch fish. I usually go in there and just drive around a little bit and just kind of get acclimated with the area, especially at low tide, because you can, learn a lot about an area, where not to run, and you can kind of see the areas where fish might move to at a higher tide as well. So it kind of gives you a float plan. It gives you a game plan as to what you need to do to be successful in those areas. So let's talk about baits that I like to throw at low tide, and then go through a progression of what I like to move to as the tide comes up and I start moving in the weed lines. Have you had an opportunity to sight fish a redfish, for example, where you're actually seeing it before you actually cast on it? Any schools or anything like that? Or I typically, like I said earlier, I like to move in real slow on the trolling motor, and when I locate them, and sometimes you can see them before you even cast at them, you know, you got to use lures that are light in presentation. And if you're into schooling fish, sometimes you can throw past them a little bigger bait that has vibration, like a paddle tail, and those tend to work in those areas. But usually when I'm getting in at low tide, I'm probably going to throw something that has a little subtle presentation, real light on the splash, so it's not spooking anything in the low water. I usually start out with something like a gold jerk shad. This is like one of my favorite tournament baits that I use. It's very light. I usually throw it on a 1/8 of an ounce to a 1/16 of an ounce twist lock hook. And I'm not sure, well, I'll show you what a twist lock hook looks like. I have a paddle tail on it right now. But you just essentially twist that lure on and you run the hook. You kind of measure it where it's going to come out and bring it through the top. It makes it weedless, it makes it snagless when you're pulling it close to oyster beds or on top of oyster beds even. But I like to throw this gulp in very low water conditions, and it has a little scent on it as well. So I mean, a lot of times you can see a fish, throw this lure anywhere close to it, and it's gonna pick up the scent. A lot of times you don't even have to move it. It'll pick up the scent, move over to it, and pick it up, and you have a fish on. As the tide, you know, starts moving up and you start seeing the water elevating itself close around the oyster beds, you know, I usually like to throw something that I can search with, like this paddle tail that I have on here. And when we start getting into a little bit higher water conditions, you know, don't be afraid to take a spoon or something that you can use to search. When most of the time you're not going to be able to see the fish before you actually make a presentation to it. So I don't know what it is about this gold piece of metal, but they seem to like it quite a bit. All the different species out there, a snook, a trout, especially a redfish, they love these gold spoons. I have a story where I was in the Mosquito Lagoon with a friend of mine, and we were in super low water conditions on a flat. And you know, like I said, I like to throw a lighter bait when I'm on the flats in shallow water, but he made a believer out of me on these spoons because I usually fish them more at higher tides on the grass lines. But he religiously threw this gold spoon, and he threw it into a school of fish and had one eat it and picked it up right away. And it was incredible. You know, it's amazing that they like these pieces of metal on a hook. Also, when the tide's coming in and you start getting into these zones where you're going to start seeing the grass lines, you've moved off the flat a little bit, you know, the oyster beds are covered. Now you're getting, you know, at a higher tide where you're getting close to grass edges and things like that, areas that, you know, you're not going to see the fish as well. Try to throw something that makes a little bit more noise. You know, at lower tides, you know, typically you're throwing baits that are a little bit lighter and more subtle in presentation, but as the tide moves in and you can't see anything, think about topwater plugs. Do you know how to, do you guys throw hard baits, lures, like a skitterwalk, which is one of my favorites for fishing around grass edges? I typically throw this, and you know, everyone knows how to. If you don't, you know, you can see YouTube videos on how to walk the dog with these lures. You're just essentially twitching your rod tip to make them dance. You know, just barely, you know, move your rod tip and the bait will just swim side to side. And I usually try to stick it as close to the grass edges as possible. And that's when your boat becomes your best tool, because you want to position yourself in an area where you can work along the grass edge. You know, I have friends that have different philosophies on how to present these baits when you're fishing around grass edges. A lot of people just like to get close enough to where you can barely get the lure to the grass edge on your longest cast and try to bring it back to you off the grass edge. What I typically like to do is get more in an angle, almost perpendicular to the shoreline, and move a little closer, and then just kind of inch your way in with using your power poles. You know, start out a little deeper and then gradually move in with your trolling motor. Put your power poles down, make your cast, and get to a point where you're close enough on the grass edge where you're running long casts along the grass edges and you're working this lure right along, making a lot of, now these lures have ball bearings, and you know they're going to attract a lot of bait fish. And the predator fish, it's feeding on bait fish. This sound seems to call them up. You know, they think it's a distressed bait, maybe a school of mullet that's being fed on, and they tend to attack that lure, and it's incredible when you get a topwater bite off of it. And it's a very good lure to use during tournaments because it's a good search bait. If you think there's fish in that area and you're not quite sure, you don't see them, throw your topwater plugs, throw the paddle tails, anything that makes a vibration or a sound. A lot of people who fishes with popping corks. Have you ever tried fishing a popping cork in a lure? And
I like my popping cork.
yeah, and those are great lures to throw at a higher tide, or great presentations to throw at a higher tide. You know, put a gulp shrimp underneath it, or fish bites like what Mark brought up here. Something with a little scent under a popping cork, and you know all they do is it mimics a fish getting thrashed on, and it attracts bigger predatory fish into that area. So don't be afraid to try different colors out. If you find that a bait's not working, you know, you're getting around an area where you're seeing activity, you're seeing fish crash on bait, and you know, they may not be on the color. You know, I have what's called, this is a Slayer paddle tail. This is a pinfish color. It kind of mimics, or you know, emulates a pinfish, you know, in pattern. It has a little gold belly on the bottom and green back. It looks like a lot of different baits that are out there. A pogie, a mullet, anything, a pigfish, all those baits that these large predatory fish like to feed on. But, you know, they may not be cued in on that. Sometimes, you know, the water may be a little dirty. That's another thing you gotta look for, the water clarity. You know, as the tide comes in, usually you start getting a little bit of cleaner water, and you can use baits that are a little darker but have a little flash to it with the gold and the silvers. When I'm getting into dirtier water, I usually like to throw something that's gonna get a little bit more attention to them. This is a little bit lighter body, a little bit lighter greenish color on the top. Looks more like a whiter bait. And you know, the white body with the chartreuse tail is something you want to throw in dirtier water, and you know, something that doesn't have the water clarity that you're expecting. But don't be afraid to try all the different variations that are out there. I throw anything from darker colors. Always have a little bit of gold in just about all my lures that I use. Redfish like gold for some reason, and they tend to, you know, the flash and the thump and the vibration of these baits usually brings them around, or you have an opportunity at a moving fish that's in the area around a grass line or around an oyster bed to see those baits. So I usually get out in those areas and try to fish the incoming tide all the way to high tide using all the different baits. But if you notice, I don't have a lot of different options. I try not to overwhelm myself or anyone that I'm with by having boxes and boxes and boxes of tackle. When I go out fishing, I usually have maybe just a few of my favorite assortment of lures, and I like to keep myself very organized so that I know what to find if I'm switching out baits and things like that. And don't be afraid to hit bottom on occasion if you're trying to get into these areas. You know, take care of your boats, be safe, you know, be smart out there, and don't crowd anglers and that sort of thing. You know, give yourself enough room out there to where you can enjoy it and keep it safe for yourself and everyone else around you. But on the same token, don't be afraid to get into an area and explore a little bit. I think that's the biggest hurdle that I had to overcome over the years, is trying to be too timid, or I'm not familiar with this area. I may not go in as deep or as long into a creek as I would normally go, just because I'm afraid that I might hit an oyster bed. Or just carefully take your time and navigate slowly, and try to look at your navigational equipment, your chart plotter on your GPS unit, get an idea of the contour of those areas, and go in there and go explore. Go try to get as deep as you can at a higher tide and work your way out as the tide starts dropping again. And you're going to see different patterns on these feeding fish on every phase of the tide, whether you're real low water or you're at a higher water and it's draining out. You're going to see that you may have a period where you're not catching anything, you're not getting any strikes, and then all of a sudden it turns on. And it's usually, I find it's going to be at the lower water incoming, or as the water starts coming out. Because what happens is, a lot of these fish, they get into these grass edges and push so far in the grass that you can't even get to them unless you happen to be in a flood tide situation, where you can target them that way as well. Just move your boat real close to the edge, or if you're a push poling person, you can actually push pole your boat in high water over the grass and catch them on flood tide situations, where you have a lot of northeast conditions or a full moon or something that really elevates the water level. And but as the tide starts dropping, you want to be on those grass edges again, because these fish are going to be pouring off the grass and sitting around these grass edges, especially on ambush points. Anywhere you see a creek mouth that forms a point, and there may be structure around it, like oyster beds or rocks or anything that they could possibly be setting up to ambush bait fish that's coming off the grass. So it's just a matter of exploring and finding the different patterns. A lot of anglers that do well out on the water, whether it be tournament fishing or recreationally fishing, they tend to get out on the water quite a bit, and they develop a pattern when and at what tide they start catching fish. But how many people, I know Mark probably keeps a log of his catches. You start thinking about what tide I may have been successful at catching this species, or at what water level, and try to make mental notes or put it on a log. Write it down on what day, what tide, what was the wind condition like, and just keep all these mental notes or written notes of all your successes out on the water on different tides and the kind of baits that you used. And I'm not going to talk at all about bait fishing, but everything, the fish that I like to target primarily, like the redfish, they love anything from blue crab, mullet, mud minnows, cut ladyfish, all of these different scents that have them going crazy. But I typically, I like to scent my lures a little bit. At times, these paddle tails that I was showing you, if you're not getting them to feed, put a little bit of Procure or any scent that you can find. These fish bites already have scent on them. Those things are amazing. They have crab scents, they have shrimp scents, and they tend to emulate those different types of scents that they're targeting. But the tools that I like to use, again, the boat is my primary thing that I use to get into these areas. Use your power poles, be patient, and don't be afraid to explore a little bit. Get into these creeks, get on the flats, and just navigate your way in, as far or as deep as you can, and look around and make some casts, and just look for the signs, the visual cues, birds that are feeding or diving. Look for disturbances, actual fish that are crashing on the surface. If you see that everything's still and there's not a lot of activity, you don't see mullet that's boiling on top of the surface, just don't even fish there. go move to an area where you can actually find, better visual cues of areas that, where it's worth actually breaking out a rod and start making casts. I'm typically gonna be in areas, creek mouths, oyster beds, flats, super shallow water areas, and anywhere where there's a grass line. And using your tools like the fishing rods and the reels, I don't like to go too heavy on my rod and reels that I use. I'm using typically anywhere from 3000 series reels to 4000 series reels at the heaviest when I'm inshore fishing around these areas that I'm talking about at low water conditions and at the higher tides. Something that's gonna have a fast action tip. I use only bull bay rods just because of the way they feel. You can make insanely long presentations, casts, and these are a little heavier in the lineup. This is a 10 to 20 pound rod, but it still has a super fast action tip that allows you to cast your lure long distances. And these are 4000 series reels. Reason why over the years I've been actually increasing my weight on reels, the 4000 series, and the 10 to 20 pounds. I started out fishing 6 to 12 pound rods, but I find that you're fighting the fish a lot longer than I care to. Typically when I get a big redfish on, I want to get it to the boat, put it in the net, and have a safe release of that fish. I don't keep a lot of fish. I like to practice conservation as often as I can. And I find that with these heavier, not too heavy, but a little heavier setup, like anywhere between 8 to 17 pound rods or 10 to 20 pound rods, just give you a little bit more backbone to bring the fish in to you quicker, and it allows you to release them safely without putting too much stress on them. And I keep a little bit lighter line so I can make longer casts. I tend to fish with 10 pound braid. There's tons of braid out there that you can use. My personal preference is that Power Pro version 2. J braid makes a really good line. Spider wire and Visibraids also fantastic. But I don't go any heavier than 10 pounds. What I usually do is I use about a 24-inch fluorocarbon leader, 20 to 30 pounds, depending on where I'm at. If I'm gonna be fishing pressed up against rocks and oyster beds, I'm usually gonna use a little heavier leader, like a 30-pound leader, so that if a fish runs you into oyster beds or into some sort of structure, you have a fighting chance of getting it out of there without it breaking you off. And don't be afraid to have 4 to 5 rods in the boat, rigged up differently. Have one with a spoon on it, have a rod with a paddle tail on it, have one with a top water plug on it, and then just have them ready for when you see the kind of conditions that lure is going to be optimal for that area. Just pick up the spoon if you're in the grass flat, or pick up the top water plug if in higher water. If you get into an area where you see fish crashing on the surface, pick up your top water plug, throw that for a minute. I tend to move around between lures, and depending on the situation, the water level, whether it's high water, low water, but I'm always trying different things, and depending on whether it's active or not. If I find, and I tend not to stay in an area very long if I'm not catching fish in there. I like to move on and find other areas where I might find those visual cues like birds, bait, current, structure, anything that, a little bit of water movement, and whatever makes you feel comfortable, like you have a chance of actually catching fish in those areas. So typically I start at low water to get acclimated with an area, work it all the way up to the higher tide, and then when the tide starts dumping out, start going back to those same zones where you started at. Kind of remember where you saw oyster beds at a lower tide, so you can get back around those areas and try them when the water's coming out, and there might be a different school of fish that might be moving through those areas on the outgoing tide. But use your tools on, get acclimated, try to make yourself a little plan, a float plan before you get out on the water. Know what kind of tide you want to be in a particular area. Look at the chart the night before, Google Earth, anywhere that can give you some insight as to where you want to target. We don't have a lot of time in the day, and I'm the kind of person that gets out early in the morning, and I usually end my day sometimes by 10 o'clock, no later than 12 o'clock. And but I always have my spots the day before that I'm going to go target, and I don't get overwhelmed, and I try not to get into the habit of running over fish by trying to cover too much or too many spots all in the same day. I just tell myself, based upon what I saw on Google Earth or on my chart the night before on my boat, I'm going to hit these 5 spots, and if I don't find them in these 5 spots, I just find, the next time I get out, I'll go find 5 different spots, other spots. But just try to have a game plan, before you get out on the water. You have a lot better successes than just going out to the boat ramp and putting your boat in the water and, start figuring things out without any preparation ahead of time. Have your rods ready, have your lures ready, and make sure you're keeping your boat in great condition, so you're not getting caught out there. Make sure that your trailer's well maintained, make sure that your trolling motor batteries are charged. Do all those things that are going to guarantee you're going to have a safe time out on the water that you can enjoy, and all your things work. I don't know about you guys, but I'm not a big fan of getting out on the water and having my trolling motor battery, die on me right as I'm getting into a school of fish, or my live well doesn't come on when I'm trying to keep a fish, healthy. If I'm in a tournament, make sure all your switches are working, you have your fuses, all that squared away, you're taking care of everything with whatever lubrication you use to keep everything optimal. And it'll just guarantee you're gonna have a better time out on the water when everything's working. But at this point, does anyone have any questions at all about what we're doing and how we're gonna get started in the day to try to get out on the water? Anything about fishing lower tides, higher tides? Yes, sir.
Birds.
A visual cue to look for, and it's such an easy call. Just drive into a spot, especially when you're sitting out here on the flats in the lagoon, and look for those areas where you see the birds actually moving around, and when you're on marsh areas like in Jacksonville or in Steenhatchee, look for those areas where you see the bird activity and you see the bait moving. But typically those are the birds that I look for. Mm-hmm. The egrets, herring, anything like that tends to feed on the shorelines. Anyone else have any questions at all? Yes, sir.
When you say the grasses, at higher tide, the grasses.
Yeah.
If I fish out of Mosquito Lagoon, are there grasses there? I just see the oyster beds and the mangroves. Are there grass lines that are, what do you refer to as grasses, I guess?
Well, typically you're going to find grass lines in places a little bit further north, towards New Smyrna. I find that there's a ton of Spartina grass in Jacksonville and in Steenhatchee area, mainly Jacksonville. Look for those grass edges in those areas. In the lagoon, I typically look for any activity bait-wise on a flat. If you're fishing out an open flat, look for those little islands and look for areas where you have depressions in between the islands that are out in the lagoon and the flats that look for points in some of the areas, the big islands that they have out, and the smaller areas that have the smaller islands, the mangroves and things like that. And then just look for points, look for areas where you have a little bit of water movement, where the wind's pressing things, on the leeward side of an island, or anything that you feel, and look for the activity, look for the bait, look for surface activity. Yeah, the lagoon is a different place than what it used to be. I know you may remember many years ago where it was lush with grass and lots of grass on the flat, and it's gotten ruined a little bit over the years, but there's still a lot of fish there. Even in those areas that look like a desert today, where there used to be a lot of grass. Those are the kind of things that I think about, where I've made mental notes. I know that there was activity here years ago when the grass existed. Those fish still got to swim through those areas. You just got to go back and check on them. Yes,
I've
sir.
heard that in recent years, I think the last big storm here, I heard a lot of the grass in this area.
Right.
And that it's starting to come back, but it's very slow.
Yeah.
And I noticed that off of our dock.
Right.
Which I told you it was, just south of here.
I find that a little bit of grass is starting to grow just north of like George's Bar and back into the north part of the lagoon. And around the south end of the lagoons, I usually look for anywhere that has a little bit of cover or points. Some of the islands, you get around Pardon Island and Cabbage and some of those areas like that have a whole little series of islands that are mixed in. Try to find those little pinch points where you have just enough water to get your boat through, and you have different banks that you can fish off of. I talk about grass edges in places like Jacksonville and Steenhatchee, but in the lagoon, you just look for areas where you have the islands, and you see where there's areas where you can navigate through on those pinch points. Anywhere you see a point from an island, stop and fish those points, because they're typically convergence zones for these fish to kind of navigate in and off the flat. So as far as fishing in lower water conditions in places like Jacksonville and Steenhatchee, don't be afraid to get out there and look for the bait, look for all the visual cues. And that's one of my biggest attributes to having a successful day out on the water. Just trust your visual cues, and if you don't see activity in an area, just don't fish there. Move on. Try to move on to one of those other spots in your 5 spots that you set up the night before that you wanted to target. And have like plan B and C. These are the 5 spots that I want to target today, but I also have these other areas that I'm thinking about targeting maybe a different day. So if you don't, if you go into those first 5 spots and you don't see any visual cues or any activity, move on to where you were going to go the following day and see if those areas are holding any activity that can lead you to find the fish that you're looking for. And does anyone have any question about? Yes.
Yeah, what impact do tides play when you're out there? I mean, is there more of a bite on the low tide than the high tide, or does it matter? Is there any impact that tide plays in your decision where to fish or when to fish?
Typically, especially in the wintertime, when it's not as, the water's a little cooler. Personally, I like to target the lower end of the tides if I'm in tidal zones. I love the first of the incoming tide and the last of the outgoing tide. But I'm usually targeting areas at the lower tide. But, if you're gonna be making a day out of it, if you have a charter, if you have some friends that you wanna take out fishing, have those high water spots as well that you can try. But me personally, I find that the better activity, the best fish bites that I've ever had, more consistently is on the lower tides. Dead low tide incoming, or the last, when it starts bottoming out back to the low tide, high outgoing. Those are the tides that I tend to target. And sometimes you're gonna have a high tide first thing in the morning. You wanna go fishing, I'm getting out on the water today. It doesn't matter what the tides are doing. But you're sitting on a high tide first thing in the morning, break out the topwater plug. Throw the heck out of a topwater plug at high tide if you have it first thing in the morning. Because those, that's usually gonna be your best bet at, especially you have the high water, you're not gonna see them pushing. You might see them tailing if you get close enough or high enough in the grass or deep enough into the grass, but when the water's water's high like that, try to use all your search baits, like your top water plugs, anything like a mirror lure, you know, your hard baits, the paddle tails that I have rigged up here that have the little vibration and thump. Just throw it as close to the grass as you can and work them out, you know, walk the dog on the top water plugs off the grass, and, you know, run your paddle tails. And what I usually do with these paddle tails at a higher tide is just I rip them through the water to it makes a lot of vibration. You know, I don't twitch it or anything. I just throw it and work the grass line or a point and just reel it back, you know, at a decent pace, decent cadence, and they'll come out and smash it 9 times out of 10. But you know, I like to fish the lower end of the water, but always be prepared for all the tides. But to answer your question, yeah, all of my successes typically are the lower incoming or outgoing, mid-tide outgoing. Does anyone else have any questions as far as you know, as far as the lures, the boat, the preparation, the rods, any of the techniques that I talked about today? Okay. So I'd like to, if anyone's interested in taking a look at the boat, I can show you a little bit more about what we have out there and what I use, you know, as far as the tools that I use to get out in the water, the trolling motor, the power poles, and I can talk a little bit more out there about different things that, you know, make the day successful. But I think with that, we're gonna wrap it up and try to get into some raffles.
Absolutely. You can go ahead and thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.